When a penniless schoolteacher stumbles through a lethal Montana blizzard to a reclusive rancher's door, and he offers marriage as a cold-blooded bargain for survival, what hidden wounds, prowling wolves, and defiant acts will turn a brutal contract into a love fierce enough to outlast winter on the frontier tonight? The wind had teeth, and it had been chewing on me for the better part of 2 days. Here, in the winter of 1883, the Montana Territory didn't just get cold. It tried to actively kill you. It was a personal, malevolent thing, this cold. It sought out the thinnest part of your coat, the smallest tear in your glove, the slightest doubt in your heart, and it pried its way inside. My breath plumed in front of my face, a ghost of the life I was still trying to cling to. Each one felt like it might be the last. The town of Haven was behind me now, a collection of dark, silent shapes huddled against the endless white. There was no haven left for me there. Not since Mr. Dubois, the head of the school board, and a man whose face seemed permanently pinched from judging his neighbors, had cleared his throat and delivered my ruin. The board has decided, Miss Larson, he'd said, not bothering to meet my eyes, that with the severity of the winter and with only 5 students remaining, it is fiscally irresponsible to keep the schoolhouse heated and operational. We will resume in the spring. Resume, I'd echoed the word, tasting like ash. Mr. Dubois, where am I to go? My salary. Your final payment is here, he'd said, pushing a small envelope across his desk. Inside were $12. A fortune a week ago, a pittance now. The boarding house may have a room. He knew full well the boarding house wouldn't have me. Mrs. Finch, its proprietor, was the chief architect of the town's gossip, a young woman all alone with no people and no husband. She'd once declared loud enough for me to hear in the general store, is either running from something or looking for trouble. In her eyes and the eyes of the town, I was both. My education, the very thing that had been my pride, was now a mark of my otherness. I wasn't a rancher's daughter to be married off. I was the school teacher, a temporary fixture, and my time was up. My parents were 5 years gone, taken by the fever back in Ohio. They had believed in books and betterment, filling my head with poetry and sums, sending me west, with the hope I'd bring a little bit of light to a dark corner of the world. All I'd found was a different kind of darkness, a cold and lonely one. So I walked. My worldly possessions were in a single worn leather valise that banged against my leg its weight, a miserable reminder of how little I had. My coat, once respectable, was now thin and frayed. Inside a small pocket, my fingers numb and clumsy, worried the last of my assets, $3 silver. Their cold metallic weight felt like the anchor that would soon pull me under for good. One for a loaf of bread that would last a few days. One for a night in a stable, perhaps, if I could find a farmer who wouldn't ask too many questions. The last one. Well, the last one was for a final desperate plea I hadn't yet formulated. The whispers of the town followed me, carried on that biting wind. Sold her family's last heirlooms for a train ticket out here. Thinks she's too good for any of the local boys. She'll be on her back or on her way out before the thaw comes. The words were cruel barbs that had once stung my pride. Now they were just a statement of fact. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered, and my pockets were nearly empty. Snow crunched under my worn boots, a lonely rhythmic sound in the vast howling silence. The sky was the color of slate, heavy and low, promising more snow. I stumbled, my ankle twisting, and fell hard into a drift. The cold was shocking, a full-body immersion that stole my breath. For a long moment I considered just staying there. It would be so easy. A quiet white end to a short, difficult chapter. The memory of my mother's face, her hand on my cheek saying, "You are stronger than you know, Abigail Rose," was the only thing that forced me to move. I pushed myself up, my clothes now damp, and clinging to me, the cold seeping in even faster. Ahead, almost a mile off the main track, a single light flickered. A pinprick of yellow in a world of white and gray. A ranch. It stood alone, isolated, a testament to either stubbornness or despair. I'd heard of the man who lived there. Blackwood, his name was. The townspeople spoke of him in low tones. A recluse. A man who had seen the worst of the war and brought it home with him. The Valley Ghost, some called him. They said he was hard, silent, and wanted nothing to do with the world. He was my last silver dollar. My last desperate hope. My feet moved on their own accord, one boot in front of the other, my eyes fixed on that light. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was just a target, the last square on the board. The walk felt like it took a lifetime. The wind tore at me, trying to turn me back. The house grew larger, resolving itself from a blur into the hard lines of a timber frame cabin with a long barn attached. Smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile ribbon against the oppressive sky. By the time I reached the porch, I was no longer shivering. A deep, dangerous calm had settled into my bones. My hands were clumsy blue-tinged claws, and it took me 3 tries to lift my fist and knock on the heavy wooden door. The sound was pathetic, a dull thud swallowed by the wind. I waited. Nothing. I gathered what was left of my strength and knocked again, louder this time, a frantic, desperate pounding. Please, please, somebody be home. Please be human. The door creaked open a few inches. A wall of warmth smelling of wood smoke and coffee washed over me, and it was so intoxicating I nearly wept. A man filled the opening. He was tall, broader than I'd expected, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving Montana landscape itself. His hair was dark, his jaw was set, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky holding a deep, guarded stillness. He looked at me, taking in my snow-caked coat and my desperate face, and his expression didn't change. It held no pity, no welcome, only a flat, weary assessment. What do you want? His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. My own voice was a pathetic whisper, broken by the chattering of my teeth. Please, sir. Just to get warm. For a moment, the storm. He said nothing. He just stared. And in that long, silent moment, I felt the last of my hope begin to fray. He was going to close the door. He was going to leave me out here to die another nameless soul swallowed by the indifferent winter. I closed my eyes, bracing for the final click of the latch. The rhythm was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. Axe up, axe down. The bite of the steel into the frozen pine, the satisfying crack as the log surrendered, the thud as the 2 halves fell apart. It was a mindless, punishing rhythm I'd perfected over 10 years. It was my church, my penance, and my only real conversation. The cold didn't bother me. I'd been cold a long time, and the chill in my bones had nothing to do with the weather. The silence of this place was my most constant companion. When I'd first bought this land after the war, after Hannah and little Samuel were taken by the diphtheria, the silence had been a scream. The house was too big, too empty. Every floorboard creaked with a memory. The kitchen smelled of her baking, the small bedroom held the phantom scent of my boy's hair. For years, I'd worked myself to exhaustion from sunup to sundown, just so I could fall into bed too tired to dream. Now the silence was just a part of me. It was a thick, heavy blanket I pulled around myself. The people in Haven learned to leave me be. They saw a grim, solitary man who wanted nothing from them, and they were happy to oblige. I went to town 4 times a year for supplies. I spoke when spoken to, kept my eyes down, and got back to my valley as fast as my wagon would carry me. They could call me the Valley Ghost for all I cared. A ghost was what I felt like. The knock on the door was so faint I thought it was a branch scraping against the roof. I ignored it. No one came out here. No one ever came out here. Then it came again, louder, more insistent. A flicker of annoyance went through me. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. A lost traveler, a desperate salesman, it didn't matter. My door was closed. But the third knock was different. It was frantic, a wild, thin sound that spoke of the ragged edge of desperation. I knew that sound. I'd heard it from men on the battlefield at Shiloh. It was the sound of a soul with nothing left to lose. With a low curse, I set the axe down and strode to the house. I opened the door just a crack, ready to send them on their way. And then I saw her. She was more snow than woman, a fragile thing that looked like the wind had assembled her out of desperation and frost. Her face was pale, tinged with blue around the lips, and her eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond the cold. She was looking at me like I was Judgment Day itself. When she spoke, her voice was a wisp of sound easily stolen by the wind. My first instinct, the one honed by a decade of solitude, was to say no, to close the door and let the wilderness solve her problem. My life was a closed loop of work and quiet misery, and I had no room for complications. A woman, especially one who looked like she was one wrong move away from shattering, was the biggest complication of all. But then I saw her hands. They were clutching the front of her thin coat, raw, chapped, and the color of deep bruises. I remembered Hannah's hands, how they'd felt in mine, always so warm. I remembered how I'd held my boy's small, feverish hand until it grew cold. Damn it all. I didn't say anything. I just stepped back and pulled the door open wider. It was an invitation of a sort, the only kind I had left in me to give. She stumbled inside, drawn to the hearth like a moth to a flame. She stood there, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards, her entire body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms as the warmth began to penetrate her frozen limbs. I threw another log on the fire, the crackle and hiss, filling the awkward silence. I poured a cup of coffee, black and strong, from the pot on the stove. I held it out to her. She looked at the mug, then at me, her eyes filled with a caution that bordered on fear. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling so badly the dark liquid sloshed over the rim. She drank it down, not seeming to notice the heat, the gulping sounds raw and desperate. I sat at the table watching her. I was a man of practicalities. Everything in my life was reduced to its essential function. The horses pulled the plow. The cattle provided meat and hide. The fire gave warmth. And this woman, what was she? A problem. An interruption. She finally turned from the fire, the coffee seeming to have thawed her voice. She told me her story in clipped, stark sentences. School teacher. School closed. No family, no money, no place to go. She delivered the facts without embellishment or tears, a litany of ruin spoken into the quiet of my home. I listened, my face impassive, but inside a strange and unwelcome calculation began to take shape. My house was clean enough, but it was a man's house. My clothes were mended poorly. My meals were repetitive. My life was a long straight line of chores without comfort. I hadn't let myself admit it for years, but the house was not a home. It was a shelter. It lacked a heart. Hannah had been the heart. Since she'd gone, it was just a collection of rooms where I slept. The thought when it came was not born of kindness or pity. It was cold, hard, and brutally practical. It was a solution to two problems, mine and hers. It was a piece of business no different than trading livestock. I let the silence stretch after she finished, letting her words hang in the air between us. I watched her, saw the flicker of fear return to her eyes as she wondered what I would do. Kick her out. Let her stay the night. She was at my mercy, and we both knew it. Finally, I spoke. The words felt like stones in my mouth, heavy and devoid of warmth. He just sat there watching me over the rim of his coffee mug. His silence was a physical presence in the room, more intimidating than any shouting could ever be. I had laid my life bare for him, offering up the pathetic inventory of my failures. Now I waited for his verdict. I felt like a stray dog who had wandered into a lion's den, hoping for a scrap and expecting a killing blow. When he finally spoke, his voice was so devoid of emotion it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "I need a woman in the house," he said, his gaze as direct and unsparing as a winter Sunday. "You need a roof over your head." I stared at him, uncomprehending. What was he saying? Was he offering me a job? A housekeeper? My mind scrambled for a reply, for some way to bargain. "I can cook," I stammered, my voice thin. "I can clean and mend clothes. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Blackwood. I can earn my keep." He shook his head slowly, a single dismissive motion. "I'm not looking to hire a servant, Miss Larson." He paused, and the air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken meaning. "This valley is a hard place for a woman alone. And this ranch, it's too much for one man. A man needs a wife." The word hung in the air between us. Wife. It was so absurd, so monstrous a suggestion that I almost laughed. A hysterical, broken sound caught in my throat. He wasn't offering me a job. He was offering me a cage. He wasn't looking for a housekeeper. He was looking for a legal, permanent fixture. A piece of property. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my newfound warmth turning to ice in my veins. "I am as serious as a heart attack," he replied, his tone unchanged. "This is not a proposal of romance. It is a proposition of survival. Your survival. And mine." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes pinning me in place. "I will give you my name, my protection, and a home that will be yours. You will want for nothing in the way of food or shelter. In return, you will run this house. You will be my wife. That is the bargain." A cold, bitter anger rose in me, overriding the fear. The sheer arrogance of it. Did he think because I was desperate, I was also without dignity? Did he see me as just another piece of livestock to be acquired? "I am not for sale, Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice shaking with a fury that surprised me. "I am not buying you," he countered, his voice dropping even lower. "I am offering you a chance to live. Look outside, Miss Larson. Look at the snow. Look at the sky. That is what awaits you. A cold, quiet death. Or you can have a warm bed, a full plate, and a future. The choice is yours. But you will make it now. I looked past him through the small window pane at the swirling white chaos of the storm. He was right. There was nothing out there for me but an unmarked grave in a snowdrift. The town of Haven had already cast me out. The world was a locked door, and this man, this hard, unfeeling stranger, was holding the only key. This wasn't a choice between freedom and bondage. It was a choice between life and death. The poetry my father had taught me, the ideals of love and courtship my mother had cherished, they were all meaningless luxuries now. This was the frontier. It was about survival, stark and ugly. He wasn't offering me a marriage. He was offering me a treaty with the wilderness, and he was the price of admission. Tears of humiliation and rage pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me weep. I lifted my chin, meeting his cold gray eyes. "I accept your proposition," I said, and the words felt like swallowing glass. I watched the war play out on her face. The shock, the disbelief, the flash of prideful anger, and finally the slow, soul-crushing acceptance. I felt a flicker of something, not guilt exactly, more like a surgeon's detachment. I had made a clean, necessary incision. It was cruel, but it was honest. I had no flowery words to offer her, no lies about affection. I had a problem, she had a problem, and I had presented the only logical solution. When she said, "I accept your proposition," her voice was flat dead. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, resentful resignation. I knew in that moment I had not gained a partner. I had acquired a prisoner. A part of me, a small, long-dormant part that remembered being a different man, felt a pang of regret. Hannah would have been appalled. She believed in love and tenderness. But Hannah was gone, and so was the man I had been. The war had burned him away, and the grief had scattered his ashes. All that was left was me, Caleb Blackwood, a man who made bargains. "Good," I said, standing up. The deal was done. "There's a small spare room off the kitchen. You can sleep there tonight. We'll ride to the magistrate in the morning." I didn't offer her a comforting word. I didn't tell her it would be all right. It wouldn't be. It would be hard and strange and lonely for both of us. But we would be alive. In this part of the world, that was the most anyone could ask for. As I turned to leave her by the fire, I felt her eyes on my back, and I knew that whatever warmth this arrangement brought to my house, it would be a long, long time before any of it touched me. The wedding was a transaction conducted in a dusty office that smelled of stale cigar smoke. The magistrate, a portly man named Mr. Davies, read the words from his book in a bored monotone. Caleb stood beside me, silent and rigid as a statue. I wore the only good dress I owned, a simple blue wool, and clutched my hands in front of me to stop their trembling. When the magistrate said, "You may kiss the bride," Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing a dry, brief kiss on my cheek. It had all the passion of a handshake. We were pronounced man and wife. We were pronounced business partners. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The whole world seemed to have gone silent. My new home, his house, felt different now. Before it was a temporary shelter. Now it was my permanent reality. The silence inside was thicker, heavier. We were two strangers, bound by a contract, circling each other in a careful, quiet dance of avoidance. The first weeks were a blur of hard, thankless work. The house had been neglected for years, not dirty precisely, but utterly devoid of comfort or care. It was a man's space, functional and grim. I scrubbed floors until my knuckles were raw, aired out musty linens, and waged a war against the dust that had settled into every corner like a shroud. I was trying to scrub away the ghost of my humiliation, trying to make a place for myself through sheer effort. Caleb never commented on the changes. He would come in from his work, eat the meal I'd prepared in silence, and then retreat to a corner with his ledgers or a book. We rarely spoke of anything beyond the necessities. "The stew needs more salt. There's a tear in your blue shirt. More snow is coming." Our conversations were as barren as the winter landscape outside, but I began to notice things, small, almost imperceptible shifts. One morning I came into the kitchen to find the wood box, which was usually my job, to fill overflowing with freshly split kindling. After a dinner where I'd eaten very little, lost in my own miserable thoughts, I found a plate with the largest piece of pie left for me on the table the next morning. These were not gestures of affection. They were acknowledgments, practical, silent considerations. He was holding up his end of the bargain. I had a roof. I had food. The loneliest moments were the nights. I slept in the small cold room off the kitchen while he slept in the master bedroom at the far end of the hall. The distance between our rooms felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. I would lie awake listening to the house settle and the wind howl and feel a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. I had traded a quick death in the snow for a slow, quiet one in this silent house. One day, to save myself from madness, I sought out the two young ranch hands Caleb employed boys who lived in a small bunkhouse near the barn. I had seen them struggling to read the labels on sacks of feed. Would you like to learn to read properly?" I asked them one afternoon. They looked at me, then at each other, their faces a mixture of suspicion and hope. The older one, a boy named Luke, finally nodded. "Reckon so, ma'am." So we began. Every afternoon for an hour, we would sit at the kitchen table, their rough, calloused fingers tracing the letters in an old primer I'd kept. For that 1 hour, I wasn't Mrs. Blackwood, the bargained-for wife. I was Miss Larson, the schoolteacher. I had a purpose again. It was a small, fragile thing, but I clung to it like a lifeline. One day, Caleb came in from the barn earlier than usual. He stopped in the doorway, watching us, his expression unreadable. I faltered, expecting him to disapprove, to tell me to stop wasting time. He just stood there for a long minute, his gaze on the book, on the boys' heads, bent in concentration on my hand, guiding Luke's finger. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. That night, when I went to light the lamp for our lesson, I found it was already filled with oil, the wick neatly trimmed. It was the closest he had ever come to giving his approval. Having her in the house was like having a ghost of a different sort. Hannah had been a creature of noise and light and laughter. This woman, Abigail, was a creature of silence and shadows. She moved through the rooms with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. The house began to change. The scent of baking bread sometimes replaced the stale air. The floors were clean, my shirts were mended, and the meals, while simple, were no longer a chore I had to force myself to perform. I told myself it was just the bargain playing out. I was providing for her, she was providing for me. It was a well-oiled machine, but I found myself watching her when she didn't know it. I'd watch her hands kneading dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd watch her stare out the window at the snow, her expression so full of a deep, aching sadness. It made something in my own chest constrict. She was tougher than I'd given her credit for. She never complained. Not about the cold, not about the work, not about the silence. There was a core of steel in her I hadn't seen that first day. I'd seen her desperation, but I had missed her strength. The day I saw her teaching the ranch hands, Luke and Jesse, something shifted in me. I had come in to fix a piece of tack and stopped cold at the sight. The kitchen was filled with a quiet murmur of her voice, patient and clear. The two boys, who were usually rough and clumsy, were still and focused, their faces full of a desperate yearning for knowledge. And she looked alive. For the first time since she'd arrived, the dull resignation in her eyes was gone, replaced by the focused, passionate spark of a teacher. In that moment, she wasn't just a component of our bargain. She was a person whole and separate, with a purpose that had nothing to do with me. I felt a confusing mix of emotions, annoyance at the disruption, grudging respect, and something else. Something I refused to name. It felt too much like the memory of Hannah teaching Samuel his letters at this very table. The memory was so sharp it was like a knife in the gut. I turned and left before any of them could see the look on my face. Later that week, she fell ill. A deep, racking cough that left her pale and weak. For 2 days she tried to keep up with her chores, but on the third morning I found her slumped over the stove, shivering with fever. The bargain had not included this. My pragmatic mind told me to let her rest, that she would recover on her own. But I couldn't. I carried her to her small bed, my arms surprised by how little she weighed. She was burning up. I spent the next 2 days forcing broth and herbal tea between her lips. I sat by her bed through the night, placing cool cloths on her forehead, listening to her ragged breathing. In her fevered sleep, she murmured names I didn't know, Mama, Papa, and wept softly. Sitting there in the dim light, watching over this vulnerable stranger who was now my wife, the neat, clean lines of our arrangement began to blur. This was not a business transaction. This was a human being, fragile and suffering under my roof. My responsibility. I felt a fierce, unexpected wave of protectiveness. The world had tried to break her, and I had used her desperation to my advantage, but I would not let her break in my house. I would not let another person I was responsible for be lost. It was a grim, determined vow, born not of love, but of a duty I hadn't realized I'd accepted until now. As my strength returned, so did a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. Caleb was still quiet, but the silence felt different. Less hostile, more watchful. He'd leave a cup of the bitter herbal tea he'd brewed for me by my bedside before he left in the morning. He spoke more, asking if I was warm enough, if I needed anything. These were small things, but in our barren world of silence, they were monumental. When the supplies ran low, a trip to Haven became unavoidable. I dreaded it. Facing the townspeople as Mrs. Caleb Blackwood was a trial I was not ready for. The journey was cold and tense. Caleb handled the horses, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The town was just as I remembered, small, gray, and judgmental. As I stepped into the general store, a hush fell over the few women gathered there. They watched me, their eyes like insects, cataloging my new coat, one of Hannah's, altered to fit me, my healthier appearance. I could hear their thoughts as clearly as if they'd shouted them. She landed on her feet, the cunning little thing. Traded her books for a bed. The worst of it came from Bart Higgins, the saloon owner. He was a big, greasy man who had always looked at me with a possessive sneer. He blocked my path as I left the store, a smirk on his face. "Well, now, if it ain't the little schoolmarm," he boomed, his voice thick with whiskey even in the middle of the day. "Or should I say, Mrs. Ghost Herd, you found yourself a warm place to ride out the winter. Tell me, was he as cold in the marriage bed as they say?" His cronies laughed. My face burned with a humiliation so hot it brought tears to my eyes. I tried to push past him, but he put a hand on my arm. His touch was damp and unwelcome. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice a strangled whisper. "Aw, don't be like that," he sneered, his grip tightening. "I made you a fair offer for winter work myself. Could have kept you warmer than that old hermit." Suddenly a shadow fell over us. Caleb had materialized out of nowhere, Silent as his nickname. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace that radiated from him was more terrifying than any shout. "Get your hand off my wife," he said. The words were low, evenly spaced, and as cold as river stones. Bart Higgins, for all his bluster, was a coward. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He looked from me to the cold fury in Caleb's eyes and took a step back. "Just making friendly conversation, Blackwood," he stammered. "We're done talking," Caleb said. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a firm proprietary gesture, and steered me toward our wagon. He didn't look at me or speak a word on the entire ride home, but I could feel the anger simmering in him. It wasn't a romantic rescue. I knew that. It was an issue of property and pride. Bart Higgins had insulted something that belonged to him. Still, as I sat beside him for the first time, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt defended. That night, the world decided to remind us that human conflicts were insignificant. A blizzard descended, a true monster of a storm that shook the very foundations of the house. And with the blizzard came the wolves. Their howls started just after midnight, a high, lonely sound that escalated into a hungry chorus. Caleb was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, his face grim. He grabbed his rifle from the mantel. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Bar the door behind me." I watched from the window as his lantern cut a shaky path toward the barn where the cattle were restless and afraid. The snow was a blinding, swirling curtain. I saw shadows moving at the edge of the light, sleek, fast, and hungry. A shot rang out, then another, a terrible guttural snarl followed by the panicked bellows of the livestock. I couldn't just stand there. My fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but the thought of him out there alone was worse. I pulled on my own boots, and my coat, grabbed the heaviest iron poker from the fireplace, and unbarred the door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, but I pushed through it, fighting my way toward the barn. The scene inside was chaos. 2 wolves were already down, but 3 more were harrying the cattle. Caleb was a grim figure of fury, reloading his rifle, his movements economical and deadly. As he raised his rifle to shoot another, a 5th wolf, the largest of the pack, burst from the shadows and launched itself at him from the side. It happened so fast. The wolf hit him high on the shoulder, and they went down together in a tangle of fur and fury. The rifle flew from his grasp. I didn't think. I screamed his name and ran forward, swinging the heavy iron poker with all my might. I brought it down on the wolf's head once, twice, a third time. There was a sickening crunch and the animal went limp. Caleb shoved the dead wolf off him, clutching his arm. Blood was already soaking through his thick coat. The remaining wolves, seeing their alpha fall, hesitated and then melted back into the storm. He stared at me, his face pale in the lantern light, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "I told you to stay inside," he gasped. "And I don't always do as I am told," I shot back, my voice trembling with adrenaline. "You're hurt. Let's get you to the house." Supporting his weight, we staggered back through the blizzard. The bargain had just changed. I was no longer just the dependent, the woman who needed saving. I had faced the wolves alongside him, and in the heart of that violent, bloody storm I realized I had not just been defending my provider or the man whose name I carried. I had been fighting for Caleb. The pain in my arm was a clean, sharp fire. It was a familiar feeling, a language my body understood from the war. What was unfamiliar was the woman half carrying me through the snow, her small frame surprisingly strong, her face set with a grim determination I had never seen before. She had run into the teeth of the danger armed with nothing but a fireplace poker. For me, the thought was a disorienting one, and I pushed it away, focusing on the simple, agonizing task of putting one foot in front of the other. Back in the house, she took charge. With a competence that stunned me, she cut away my bloody shirt, her touch gentle but firm. The wolf's teeth had torn deep into my shoulder and bicep. "It needs to be cleaned and stitched," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear I knew she must be feeling. For the next hour, she was a general commanding a field hospital of one. She boiled water, sterilized a needle and thread in the flame of a lamp, and washed the wounds with whiskey. I gritted my teeth, the liquor's sting a white-hot agony that made the world go gray at the edges, but I did not make a sound. I watched her face, her brow furrowed in concentration, a stray lock of hair falling across her forehead. She was no longer the frightened girl who had appeared at my door. She was a woman of incredible hidden strength, a woman who had saved my life. When she began to stitch the ragged flesh together, her movements were deft and precise. "My father was a doctor for a time," she explained, her voice low. "He taught me some things." She worked in the quiet, methodical way she did everything, and I just watched her, stripped of my strength, my defenses torn away just like my shirt. For the first time in 10 years, I was completely and utterly dependent on another person. The vulnerability was terrifying, and yet as her hands worked to mend my body, I felt a different kind of healing begin, a slow, painful thawing around the frozen lump of my heart. For the next few days, a fever took hold of me. The world became a hazy fog of pain, chills, and unsettling dreams. I dreamt of Shiloh, of the faces of the dead. I dreamt of Hannah and Samuel, their faces fading, their voices calling to me from a great distance. Through it all, there was a constant, calming presence. Abigail. She was always there, pressing a cool cloth to my head, spooning broth into my mouth, her quiet voice pulling me back from the bad dreams. She kept the fire roaring, tended the livestock, and held the entire ranch together while I lay helpless. I began to see that my bargain had been the proposition of a fool. I had thought I was offering her shelter, a roof, a means of survival. I had seen myself as the provider, the strong one. I had been wrong. From the moment she had started teaching the ranch hands, from the moment she had stood up to Bart Higgins's taunts with quiet dignity, and now as she single-handedly saved me and my livelihood, I saw the truth. I needed her far more than she needed me. I had offered her a roof, but she was offering me a life. One evening, the fever finally broke. I woke up, my head clear for the first time in days, my body weak but my own again. The house was quiet. A single lamp burned on the table, casting a warm golden glow. Abigail was sitting in a chair by the fire, her head bent over a piece of mending. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was one of peace. I watched her for a long time, the rhythmic pull of her needle the only sound. The lamplight caught the soft curve of her cheek, the line of her throat. A feeling I had long since buried, a deep, profound ache of longing and tenderness, rose up in me with an intensity that stole my breath. It wasn't just gratitude. It was more than respect. It was the simple, terrifying, and undeniable truth. I loved this woman, this stranger, this wife of mine. "Abigail," I said. My voice was a rough, rusty croak. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She put her sewing aside and came to the bed, placing a cool hand on my forehead. "The fever's gone," she whispered, a small, relieved smile touching her lips for the first time. "Abigail," I said again, finding my strength. I had to tell her. I had to undo the cold, hard bargain and replace it with the truth. I was wrong. She looked confused. "Wrong about what? You need to rest, Caleb." "No," I insisted, pushing myself up on my good elbow. "I was wrong that day. The day you came here. The proposition I made. I took a ragged breath. I told you it was a bargain for survival, your roof for my household. It was a cold, selfish thing to say. A lie." Tears welled in her eyes, and I knew she thought I was about to cast her out to end the arrangement. "I didn't lie," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It was what we both needed. It was what I thought I needed. I corrected her, my voice raw with an emotion I hadn't let myself feel in a decade. I thought I just needed a housekeeper, a pair of hands. But sitting here watching you hold everything together, saving me, I realize I haven't been truly alive since Hannah and my boy died. I've just been existing, working, waiting to die. I reached out with my good hand and took hers. It was small and warm in my own calloused one. You, Abigail Rose Larson, you brought this house back to life. You brought me back to life. I don't just need a woman in the house. I need you. I need your strength and your kindness and your fire. I need you more than I need this land, more than my next breath. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers tightened around mine. She leaned forward, and for the first time she kissed me. It wasn't the passionless peck from the magistrate's office. It was a soft, hesitant press of her lips to mine, a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow and a fragile, blossoming hope. It was the sealing of a new bargain, one made not of necessity but of the heart. The spring that followed was not just a season. It was a resurrection. As the heavy blanket of snow receded, revealing the sleeping green earth beneath it, felt as if the world and our lives were being reborn. The ice that had locked away the creeks for months broke apart with a great groan, and the rushing water was the sound of our future beginning. We worked side by side, a true partnership forged in the crucible of that long, hard winter. The silence that had once defined our existence was now filled with the easy rhythm of shared labor and conversation. We mended the fences damaged by the snow, his strong hands guiding the posts while mine wrapped the wire. We planted a garden near the house, a riot of greens and reds and yellows that I had sketched out on paper during the final snows. Caleb, who had never thought of planting more than was necessary for survival, found a surprising joy in turning the earth and watching the small, hopeful seeds we planted together sprout and grow. The biggest change came to the house itself. With Caleb's help, we cleared out the spare room, my former room, and turned it into a proper schoolhouse. He built 2 long tables and benches from spare lumber, his hands once used only for the hard tasks of the ranch now creating a place of learning. The children of the handful of families in our valley began to arrive each morning, their bright, eager faces a stark contrast to the lonely solitude that had once filled these walls. The sound of their laughter and recitation became the new heartbeat of our home. The town of Haven watched the changes from a distance. Their gossip didn't cease, but its tone shifted from derision to a sort of grudging wonder. When we drove the wagon to town, the whispers were different. They saw the new strength in my posture, the quiet contentment that had settled in Caleb's eyes. Bart Higgins no longer met my gaze, and Mrs. Finch from the boarding house even offered me a curt, respectful nod once. We had not sought their approval, but in building our own world, we had earned their respect. One evening, as the summer sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and purple, we stood on the porch looking out at the valley that was our home. The day's work was done. The sounds of crickets filled the warm air. Caleb slipped his arm around my waist, his touch now as familiar and welcome as the warmth of the Sunday. He was no longer the valley ghost, and I was no longer the desperate schoolteacher. We were simply a man and a woman who had found each other in the dark. "Do you ever think about that first day?" I asked, softly leaning my head against his good shoulder, now fully healed. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel the rumble in his chest as he spoke. "Every day," he said. "I think about the fool I was, trying to make a business deal with my own heart." I smiled, turning to face him. It was the best bargain I ever made. He lowered his head and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss, filled with the quiet certainty of all that we had overcome and all that was yet to come. Our beginning had been one of necessity, a cold and practical contract written against the backdrop of a brutal winter. But from that harsh soil, something beautiful and resilient had grown. From $3 silver and a desperate knock on a stranger's door, we had built more than a home. We had forged a family and found a love as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above us. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.